there was a lot of rediscovery, and I think the key is Giverny. Not so much American Impressionism, but Giverny, and that's what I want to emphasize. You could go to the next slide, please, Della. It's nice to boss a director around. So I love the old photographs of what Giverny was like when the artist first arrived there. Very much rural, agricultural, small village 40 miles from Paris. And of course, that trip was made possible by the railroad, which facilitated the artist going out into the countryside. I also like the little sketches by A.B. Frost. He was a major illustrator at the turn of the 20th century. That was the heyday of American illustration. Think of N.C. Wyeth, for instance. And he did these lovely sketches. They were published in 1924 for Scribner's. You'll see two paintings by him in the gallery. One lovely soft greens, yellows, and one that is entirely gray. And there's a story behind the grisaille one, the gray one. It turned out he was colorblind. So he's better off being an illustrator, but I think, so.
Well, as we begin talking, so in the Shadow of Monet, so this is not a Monet show. So that is something that has been really fun to talk to Martha about and learn about is who were Monet's friends? Was he a teacher? Who was available to have conversations with Monet? And as I have found out, not many.
Monet preferred to be somewhat aloof from these interlopers. He went to Giverny in 1883, frankly, to escape. He was, and I don't say this to everybody, he was living with a woman who was not his wife, and her husband was still alive. So Giverny was a nice, comfortable destination in the middle of nowhere, almost. He spent half his life in Giverny. He was 46 when he arrived, died in 1926. And I assume that most of you are familiar with the wonderful Columbia Museum painting. It's kind of archetypal Impressionism. It's a foundation, departure point of the exhibition. But the important thing to remember is that Monet was not a participant in this art colony. He was there. I love the expression that he was present, but he was absent. He did have exchanges with a few artists, and the first American artist to come to Giverny was none other than John Singer Sargent. And we see a painting on the right that's not in the exhibition, alas, that is by Sargent, and it shows us Monet painting en plein air, easel set up in the forest with his wife. I think they were married by then, Alice. And there's a wonderful story that goes like this. Sargent wanted to paint a landscape. He was not prepared with materials. And so he asked Monet if he could have some. And so Monet gave him a palette and set out some colors. And Sargent looked down and said, well, there's no black. And that's because, according to legend, Monet never used black. He created shadows out of a combination of colors. Besides, he believed that shadows are not black, that shadows have color. So that's a wonderful painting that records their friendship. They were of artistic and I think somewhat social peers. In the exhibition, we are not represented by one of those sensational portraits that Sargent is known for the high society and the aristocracy, but a very intimate charcoal drawing. It's from 1924, so this is well after his very successful career. In fact, in 1907, he gave up painting these fancy portraits and turned to charcoal drawings, and over time he did 700 of them. And this is very fresh, and I think you can see even the charcoal kind of has a kind of impetus of Impressionism in it. There are other artists, yes. Mm-hmm. There are other artists. There's a wonderful painting by Theodore Butler. As I'm trying to make the point, Monet was somewhat aloof, but somehow Theodore Butler managed to wheedle his way into the family. Butler ended up marrying one of Monet's stepdaughters, Suzanne. Monet was not happy about this. For one thing, Suzanne was one of his favorite models. And so to have her become the wife of an American and maybe move to the States, he was pretty upset by this. And on the lower right, you see a painting that's not in the exhibition, but by Theodore Robinson, who is represented in the exhibition by a wonderful, fresh, intimate landscape. Robinson recorded Butler's marriage. And there in the foreground, you see Monet and his stepdaughter, followed by Butler and Mrs. Monet, Madame Monet, Alice, and that would have been her mother, the mother of the bride. Now, the Butler painting is really, I think, special. It has some of the same colors as the Monet in the Columbia collection, but it also transcends. It departs from Impressionism with those bright red colors that define the trees. And it's a painting from about 1913 when artists were moving away from Impressionism and exploring more vivid approaches to painting landscape. Of course, landscape was what it was about. Giverny was pastoral and pretty. I think we might have an illustration of that. Yes. This is one of my favorite pieces. In fact, I rarely say that. As a curator, it's like choosing, your favorite child. This has got to be the smallest painting in the exhibition. Okay, it's just this wonderful, fresh sketch. But it illustrates so beautifully the whole idea that the artists were going out into the landscape, painting what we call en plein air, in the fresh air. It's on a panel, which means it's a firm surface, so that the artist didn't have to have an easel, wasn't complicated, he could paint quickly. And then what's special about this painting, and you'll see the illustration on the label, is that on the backside, on the verso, is a horizontal landscape of a different time of day. And you probably all know that the Impressionists were interested in light effects, different times of day, different seasons, and this is a kind of a twofer illustration of just that. And it's precious, and it's really a wonderful example of painting out of doors.
And Giverny, the town. Tell everyone a bit about the town.
Well, the town, we typically, categorically or casually say, I should say, that it was along the Seine. Not true. It was located on the Epte River, E-P-T-E, which is a tributary to the Seine. And so there's a nice Willard Metcalf painting on the left there, and it shows. It was hard for me to figure out exactly where the stream is. It's where the dark green is in the middle of the middle ground. And it's also very lush. It suggests a particular time of year. It's early spring, and it gives us a sense of the place of Giverny. You can see how rural it is, how unspoiled it was. Metcalf was one of the earliest artists to arrive in Giverny. They started arriving in the mid-1880s, and by the time the colony kind of dissipated, over 350 artists had gone through Giverny from 18 different countries. So it was not just Americans who descended on Monet and his wonderful gardens.
Because it was close to Paris.
It was close to Paris, and a lot of the painters were students in Paris. So they were going out oftentimes in the summertime, because Paris, anybody been in Paris in the summertime? This is, no. So that was a good reason to go out, paint landscapes, be in the countryside, and the social life. Don't forget that artists are social animals. Many of them stayed in a hotel called the Hotel Baudy. Now that's spelled B-A-U-D-Y. It's not bawdy. But yeah, well, they're They drank the wine, they ate the meals, they socialized, they played music, they sang, they danced together, and in the daytime they actually played tennis across the street on some tennis courts. So it was a lively community. They painted on a regular basis, but not every single moment. Some artists only visited for 12 days. Some artists stayed for 20 years. So you can see that there's a great deal of variety. The painting on the right by, I have to get this right, John Ireland Howe Downes, shows this panorama of the countryside. It gives you a sense of there were hills behind, and of course this gave a change in terrain. Artists could look down on the small town of Giverny.
So, and talk about the ruralness.
Yes, and what do we have? Of course, we have the subject that Monet made famous, haystacks.
Haystacks.
And you probably know that over time, Monet painted more than 24 haystacks, but he had a particular purpose. He had an agenda, and that agenda was to study color and light as it changed different times of day, different seasons. He painted in the snow, he painted in the hot of summer. The American artists didn't have that persistence, particularly, and so they often painted the haystacks, at least in terms of the ones in the exhibition, from a more kind of just fixed features in the landscape. I like the Meteyard painting on the left, where the haystacks are not particularly well formed, they're kind of floppy. So we have this idea of perfect kind of conical shapes. Well, that's not always true. And this painting has an engaging title. It's called Les Demoiselles, the Little Ladies, Little Ladies Haystacks. On the right, the Dawson Watson painting, and I'm not stuttering there. It's Dawson Watson. It is of very different nature. It's the biggest painting in the exhibition. It's sensational. It has a different flavor because it's a narrative. We get involved in the laborers. They are at work. And you'll notice that their woman is foregrounded, but then there are three figures that help march us into the landscape, into the background where we can see the farm buildings. This painting, in a way, is a throwback to an earlier era of painters, the painters who painted outside of Barbizon, which was in the forest of Fontainebleau. And they were the first French artists to really discover the landscape. And they often painted the farm laborers. And so her figure is very much like those painters, but the handling of the paint around her in the foreground, the sheaves of wheat are all very impressionistic in terms of the way they are treated. And of course the color, the sunshine, really suggest the landscape. You'll see quite a few of haystack kind of paintings, different times of season. There's one that's winter, very clearly winter time. You've got the grisaille one, which could be on a gray day. Who knows?
So there were series, and not just haystacks.
Yep.
There were series of what
Yep.
we all think about,
Yes.
the beautiful lilies.
The beautiful lilies, right? That's the other. And I think in this respect, Monet set an example. But there was also the obviousness. This was what was in Giverny, what Giverny was about. Now, as I keep stressing, not many artists had access to his wonderful water lilies and his gardens. But we are lucky to have a painting by Blanche Hoschedé-Monet. She's not American, as you might be able to tell, and it's on loan to us from the Columbia Museum in Ohio. Blanche Hoschedé-Monet, and this gets confusing, so listen carefully. She was a stepdaughter and a daughter-in-law, okay? So Monet had a family. He married Alice, who had a family. So they became his stepchildren, and one of the sons of Monet married one of the daughters of Alice. So This means that she was intimate. She had access, ready access to these wonderful water lilies. She painted regularly at his side. She was maybe mentored by him, but he never was a teacher of really of anybody, family or formal students. He chose to be independent. This is a particularly interesting take on the water lilies. I like the way the willows in the background. The willows sort of surround the ponds, and she's created the screen so that we cannot go off into the distance. Many of the Monet water lilies, there's a sense of limitless space, infinity. And of course, towards the end of his life, when he was painting those large canvases, they become almost abstractions and kind of these grandiose visions. So juxtaposed
is a treasure.
Yes, a special treasure. And note the names. I think there's a nice coincidence. Blanche and Blondel. No? Okay. Blondel Malone spent her childhood here in Columbia. So she's not a native, but she spent her childhood. Her father owned a music store, which was on Main Street. They had a house on Divine Street, 1516 Divine Street. The house is no longer there, sadly. She was not particularly partial to Columbia. Take that as you will. She went to Converse College because her father had a music store. She studied music. She also studied French. But she discovered there that art. She wanted to become an artist. She was petite, she was vivacious, and she was a redhead. She also had a little bit of spirit. She had gall. So she asserted herself, and she wrote letters to, first of all, to Mary Cassatt, the great American Impressionist who had become an expatriate. And Mary Cassatt offered some advice. She said, don't live in Paris, but go to the Louvre, which is a little contradictory. How do you go to the Louvre without living in Paris? But so Blondel took that to heart. She also wrote to Claude Monet, and he wrote back and said, it annoys me, but I'm willing to see you tomorrow or the day after. So Blondel jumped at the opportunity to visit him. She arranged to have a wheelbarrow full of paintings so that he might look at her work. And when she first went in to meet him, he said, well, do you speak French? And she said, no. But then she realized that he didn't speak English, and so the interview wasn't going to go anywhere. So she ended up speaking French. I guess her redheadedness, her vivaciousness charmed him. They spent most of the day together. We're very lucky that Blondel Malone wrote letters home. She was devoted to her parents, much as she didn't want to be here with them. But after all, her father was paying the bills. So she had to keep communicating. There's a wonderful letter that she wrote, and since you both had a fabulous exhibition of Rodin's work, I thought you would enjoy this little snippet that she wrote home. This was a visit to Rodin's studio. One day I was there. He got very interested in me and asked if I were a virgin. Can't you see by my card that I am Miss Malone? I said. That signifies nothing as a rule. And she retorted, but I am honest. If Mademoiselle is on my card, I am quite innocent. So, good for her. She also, in an earlier letter, she thought this idea of going to college to get married is sort of for the birds. So she remained single for most of her life. She did get access to the water lilies of Monet's. We don't know if the two watercolors that are in the exhibition were done in Monet's garden. It would be nice to think that they were. but they're not dated and they're not inscribed with a location, unfortunately.
But it is that they are beautiful, and it is an opportunity for the watercolors to be put on view. They're part of the, 3 are on view. These 3 are part of the museum's permanent collection. And as you know, we less often are able to put watercolors because works on papers are so fragile. So if they're on view for these few months, they'll have to go into rest. So we are delighted they have a chance to join their friends.
Yes, that's right.
Well,
in fact, one of the things I enjoyed doing was mining the Columbia Museum collection. And you'll notice a case in the first gallery of sketches by Kenyon Cox. And Noel had the opportunity and pleasure to make those selection. It's a group of sketches that we have to admit were done well before Impressionism in the 1870s, where they're very academic, very traditional. The Impressionists were painting themselves, but these sketches have nothing to do with Impressionism. But it gives you a sense of what the artists were doing when they were studying at the various academies in Paris. The other piece,
yeah,
yes.
and like this very piece, there were also spouses and friends that were not painting, but living and working around Giverny.
Yes, and lots of women, like Josephine Lewis. Many of them, not in this case, but many of them were students of Fred MacMonnies, and the sculpture is in the CMA collection. And it may seem odd that there's a sculpture here in an exhibition that you might think was entirely paintings or sketches. But he was an important fixture in the art colony. And I think there's also a wonderful contrast, kind of serendipitous, to the Rodin show that you just had, because his work is much more conventional, much more traditional, much more detailed, and it's a wonderful example of really the craft of bronze sculpture. He's an important figure because he was a long-term resident. He would commute to a studio in Paris, come out for the weekend, year-round, and he had a garden. Yes.
And those gardens were quite important.
Yes. It allowed, for instance, his wife, Mary Fairchild MacMonnies, to paint nudes because it had been a former priory and it was a walled garden, and so it was very private. Mary Fairchild was not the only member of the art colony to paint nudes in the garden. In fact, that became a whole theme for the artist towards the end of the evolution of the colony. This is the only example outdoors. There are others like the Louis Rittman, and that particular painting reminds me of none other than Auguste Pierre Renoir. Its wholesomeness, its robustness, if you will, and of course, and even the posture. But it's not, the treatment, the paint treatment is not like Renoir. If you know Renoir's painting, he kind of has dappling flesh. This is much more conventional and academic. And then centerpiece is your wonderful Richard Miller painting. And it looks wonderful as a centerpiece on the wall. And I think an excellent example of the influence of Japanese art on Impressionist painters. And that was a whole phenomena going back to James Whistler, Claude Monet. They had collections of Japanese prints. So did Van Gogh, Gauguin. They all were fascinated with this other culture, as it were, and collected. And so you can see the theme relates to Japanese prints. Beautiful woman looking in a mirror, the various angles of the composition, the angle of the bench she's sitting on, the angle of the windows, the angle of the mirror. Things don't quite line up, but that's very much the Japanese aesthetic.
Well, and not everything has what you would consider or first think of as a very impressionistic style. There are pieces in the collection in room 4 as the exhibition winds down that are beginning to show that there is this sense and moment of modernism that is being born.
Right, now I would say it kind of winds up.
Winds up, yeah, winds up,
Yeah,
and then they go.
And then they go. There you go. Indeed, and again, it was nice to use a painting from the CMA collection, the William de Leftwich Dodge, the very muscular man with the scythe. The painting is very muscular in the way it's painted, very broad brushstrokes. And there's a reason behind that. And that is that Dodge made his reputation and really his life work was painting murals. If you think of murals way up high in the dome of the Library of Congress, he obviously had to upscale, as it were, the figures. They had to be readable from down below. He couldn't do intimate little things. So he still is doing that kind of approach in The Man with the Scythe. And then the Lilla Cabot Perry on the left, another example of a woman artist. She did become a good friend of Monet, and I think in part because she was there 9 years at various intervals, also in part because she came from a distinguished Boston family, the Cabot family. She had means. She was in a position to be a liaison from Monet to various collectors, and so she was able to place paintings. So, they're always a kind of inside story of things. This is a loan from the Gibbs Museum of Art. I remember this painting well when I was curator there. It had a really incredibly ugly frame on it. But I have to tell you, I'm not enamored with the frame that's on it now either. So, and of course, this is not a Giverny painting. It's a painting from 1926, and it's of the hills of New Hampshire. But she was a thoroughgoing Impressionist, and you can see when you look at the painting, the brushwork, the interest in different seasons, color, light, reflection off the snow. So this is a nice addition to the exhibition.
Thank you, Martha Severens.
Thank you.